fear hates facts. Like imposter syndrome or any kind of negative emotion is, especially if it's fear-based, fear will shrivel up and die when you shine like some facts on it. So just remember, fear hates facts. Like, okay, I'm not feeling up for this. Why? Like, what's going on? What's the data? What's the truth that supports this fear? And I bet 9 times out of 10, or probably closer to 10 times out of 10, there won't be any facts supporting the fear. But what I can guarantee people have is a boatload of facts supporting that they actually are capable or are worthy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Flow Over Fear podcast, where it is our mission to help you to rise above fear and realize your ultimate potential in leadership and life. I'm your host, Adam Hill, and it is my goal to share with you the human side of high performance. My guests share their experience with fear, anxiety, struggle, challenge, and most importantly, despite all of it, how they rose above it to achieve incredible results. So, if you're ready to rise up, let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to Flow Over Fear. And today is a great show because we're going to talk a lot about imposter syndrome. And I know that's something that we all deal with, especially for top performers. I mean, imposter syndrome and, self-doubt, those kinds of things, and all these negative thoughts that clutter our minds, it can be especially debilitating. So that's where my guest today comes in. John Mollura is a professional speaker, a keynote speaker who went from being a literal rocket scientist to a multi-award winning luxury portrait photographer. And we're going to dig in deep to that because that's a big contrast. His unique career path provided life experiences that most only dream of. John spent many decades leading a variety of teams, some that landed missions on Mars. And he now provides world-class portraits and photographs that have been featured by National Geographic, multiple Fortune 500 companies, and some of the biggest names in music. And today, John educates and empowers his audiences, his keynote audiences, during his keynotes on unmasking imposter syndrome and believing that positive change is possible. As a keynote speaker, John specializes in connecting with audience members who are accustomed to performing at elite levels. And John also incorporates research with stories from his own life to give you the tools to break out of the prison of your limiting beliefs and begin living life as your truest and most contented self. John, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, man. Thanks for reading that intro just like we put together.
Yeah. Absolutely. I didn't do that on the fly, did I, at all? No, it's it's interesting. A lot of people can they use that typical saying where if they want to tell someone they're not smart enough or something like that, they'll say, "I'm not a brain surgeon" or "I'm not a rocket scientist." You can't use that excuse. How has that affected you? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I get to actually say, I can say, look, this isn't rocket science. And I can actually say that with authority. So
right.
People make it too complicated and be like, this isn't rocket science. I've seen that. There's lots of letters in that math.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have that credibility. Well,
that's right.
Well, rest assured, we won't be digging deep on rocket science today because I'm not a rocket scientist. And nor am I a brain surgeon. But your story is fascinating. And I can't wait to dig in because that contrast between being a rocket scientist for NASA and working that environment, missions to Mars and those kinds of things, huge contrast to being a portrait photographer. So we'll kind of get into that contrast, but I'm always interested in origin stories, and I really want to hear about your origin story, how you came to become a NASA scientist, and where that desire came from.
Yeah, so as a child of the late 70s and early 80s, I of course had oodles of Star Wars stuff on my wall, and all the Millennium Falcon, all the things that went along with Star Wars. So I was, that's just the world I grew up in, thinking about far-fetched, far-reaching places, and I truthfully don't know how I ended up in mechanical engineering at Penn State University in the 90s. I'm pretty sure a guidance counselor probably told me I'd be good at it. And a recurring theme of my life until recently is I always jokingly say I just kind of Forrest Gumped my way through, just kind of fell into, various situations. And the way I ended up working in that industry was, it actually, the lowly creature of a mouse actually has a big influence on my life, with the first being, when I was a junior in college, I was one of the finalists to get a very coveted spot as an intern at Walt Disney with their Imagineers, like the people that like create the things,
Oh yeah.
And, it came down to me and one other person, and because they were a semester ahead of me, because I'd taken some time off to do a co-op, I lost the position. And I was, I was crestfallen when I got that call. And this is 1999, so, the phone was still, I had to hang it up on the wall, where I lived. And one of the guys that I lived with walked in. Right after I hung up the phone, I just sat down on the couch, and I was just defeated, man. And my buddy Bill said, "Hey, dude, you all right?" I'm like, "No." I'm like, "I just lost the only thing I thought I was going to be doing this summer." He said, "Well, you're outdoorsy. You're active." He's like, You want to work at a Boy Scout camp, like as a director?" And I'm like, I was not a Boy Scout. I didn't wear the goofy shorts or anything like that, or sing the campfire songs. And I said, I don't really know much. And he goes, "Well, we'll send you to training. No problem." And I was supposed to be director of water sports. So I had these visions of, driving a speedboat and helping people learn how to water ski and, do all this
Baywatch
cool
all day.
Yeah, right. Yeah, running in slow motion.
Oh, yeah.
But that training wasn't until June, and college got out in May. And so the first, influence of my life that had to do with a mouse was Mickey Mouse rejecting me. And I go to work at this Boy Scout camp. It was, I forget, it was like almost 20,000 acres up in the Catskills, like of New York. And it was beautiful, giant sprawling complex. And in the interim between when all the scouts showed up and when I got there at the beginning of May, they said, "You can work with the maintenance crew." And I'm like, all right, that's cool. So the second part where a mouse comes into play was my job being the unskilled labor. I'd just have to schlep all the tools for all the guys throughout the woods.
Right.
Was I would get the really unglamorous jobs, with the least glamorous being pulling dead mice out of toilets that had fallen in during the winter when camp was shut down.
Oh,
my
geez.
job. I had a checklist of all these cottages and buildings I had to go in and pull like dead mice out of toilets.
Well, that must have been at least some kind of poetic justice after being rejected by the first mouse, right?
I don't know. I feel like it got revenge. I mean, 'cause
yeah, sure.
it wasn't pretty. So I'm like, well, just had the those Baywatch visions, those Hasselhoff visions of, all right, well, I'm going to get to drive speedboat and do all this stuff. Sure enough, they come up to me and say, "Hey, the person that did the job last year you're supposed to do, they're coming back, so it doesn't make sense to train you."
Oh, wow.
So here I am again. They're like, "But hey, the maintenance crew is really impressed with your work ethic. So you're welcome to stay on with them." I'm like, crap. We pulled dead mice out of toilets for the next 2 months.
Right.
And they said, or you could be director of rock climbing. And I'm like, I'll take it.
Yeah.
At the time, like when they came up and pitched this to me, I was like scrubbing rust off like propane tanks.
Sure.
Like, that was my job. Like for that afternoon, I'm like, I'll do it. Anything but whatever I'm doing now.
Yeah.
So they sent me to training, learned how to rock climb, ran a staff, safely had hundreds of kids rappel throughout the summer. So I put that on my resume when I graduated. And I was interviewing for a company that was a NASA subcontractor for like a program manager position. I was coming out of college. I didn't know what program management was. Knowing what I know now, I probably would have lasted about 2 months in that because I would have been a horrible fit.
Yeah.
But they saw in my resume, what's this rock climbing? Because I had all the co-ops and internships with engineering firms. They're like, why is this like top of the line? I'm like, well, yeah, I thought you had leadership. I explained what I did. And they go, hang on, there's someone we want you to talk to. And the phone went like on mute. And I'm like, just kind of sitting there like,
yeah.
Okay, now what? And this dude got on the phone, didn't introduce himself at all. Real nasally voice goes, hey, what do you think about rock climbing on Mars? And me being just a, prolific smartass said, well, are you going to pay the airfare? So I'm in. And as I said that, I'm like, oh my God, I just blew this interview. And this dude, this phantom voice on the other end of the phone goes, get him down here. And like, they said, all right, Skip wants to see you.
Yeah.
Here's when you can come down. I'm like, what just happened?
So for all those listening, smartass humor would open a lot of doors for you. So.
Oh yeah, it'll also slam them shut pretty quick too. I got a lot of data on that.
I'm sure.
That time it worked out. So I came down and interviewed with this guy who, hopped on the phone. Turns out he was the lead test engineer for the landing systems for the NASA Pathfinder Mars mission, and then this was 2000, so the MER exploration missions that landed in 2003.
Wow.
And what caught his eyes was the fact that I had, moderate book smarts. I met my goal. I graduated with over a 3.0 in engineering, which was a huge feat because I'm not real book smart. It was a lot of work for me. But he saw that I not only had, enough book smarts, but I had some practical skills too. Because his background was he was a special forces operator in Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
And went on to do testing and survival skills training for the military for decades after his time in special forces. And so he and I hit it off like a ball of fire, and that's how I ended up in the test engineer position I did. And it was a great gig. I worked there for a little over 15 years.
Wow. So yeah, and that's such a fascinating transition. I mean, and it goes to show, I think, that sometimes we can't anticipate what's going to lead us to those directions. Rock climbing led you to Mars missions, which is just fascinating. And so in those 15 years, I mean, you're kind of getting everybody's dream job at that point. You're doing all these missions and all of that kind of stuff. How did that unfold for you? Were you enjoying it? Was it something that you found fulfilling early on? How did that develop?
It was very, we were obviously very mission oriented, and what was great was it was a pass fail kind of thing, which I always feels easier. It either works or it doesn't. And I was able to work with some extremely amazing people from whatever we were doing, whether we were in Antarctica or Sandusky, Ohio in February. Like I was just always blessed to work with these amazing people. But during the time, I went through a lot of personal transitions that really changed my outlook on things, because I was never, even though I had this dream job on paper, I was never really fulfilled. I never really believed I had what it took. I can remember I got a letter of commendation from the Department of Defense for something that, I was one of the leads on. And I remember when they gave me the letter of commendation, I was almost in tears when I was on stage, not because I was so proud or I was nervous being in front of people. I just had this belief that they were going to go to hand me the thing and be like, psych, we actually know you're not as good as this paper says you are.
Yeah.
When, I had we'd done the thing. Like the thing was out in the Pacific Ocean doing what it was intended to do. Right. But I just had this core belief that I wasn't good enough, and I really carried that with me. And I didn't know what imposter syndrome was for probably another decade after that. But I just had that. I had this, like you said, dream job, but it really didn't fulfill me, which is why after I've gone through so much of the self work and really finding my own path, why I have such a heart to help people. It's like Rory Vaden, the author Take the Stairs, always says, you're best suited to serve the person you used to be.
Absolutely.
And that's where this kind of mission and this heart has come from for what I'm doing now.
Yeah. So when you talk about being unfulfilled in that dream job, and this imposter syndrome that you're feeling, is there any kind of correlation there? Was the lack of fulfillment led by the feeling of imposter syndrome?
The imposter syndrome was a byproduct of, various things. And that's what I talk about a lot. A lot of my imposter syndrome talking is educating people on it, because a lot of people don't even know what it is, but like you said, they've experienced it. So, there's so many reasons why imposter syndrome can show up, but the unfulfillment was just, I just had this core belief that I was unworthy of the accolades, of love, of admiration. For instance, like if you would have read that bio of me like 8 years ago, like I probably would have just slunk down and been like, oh man, I feel so embarrassed to hear all that. Whereas now it energizes me to be like, that's right. Yeah. I did that stuff. And on days when I'm not feeling up for it, I can look back on things like that. And just realize, what I have accomplished, and that I can, I can do the hard things.
Yeah. So I know we're going to jump ahead a bit here, but what was the switch that flipped? Or I mean, probably wasn't a switch, but more of a ongoing process. But what changed in order for you to see that differently?
It was a switch of a traumatic event of losing my best childhood friend to suicide in 2009. And it was right after our first child had been born. I was already having so much self-doubt, and I hit rock bottom after he passed away. Like I was still, in the engineering job, becoming like one of the leaders. I'd been there for almost a decade at this point. And it just rocked my world, because he was not only a friend, but he was a year ahead of me. So I looked up to him like a big brother too. And when that got added on to the anxiety and just uncertainty that I felt being a new father, I ended up in a really just bad headspace. I was just in this proverbial, fog. Like I just couldn't focus, couldn't do things, and it went on for months. And I remember that one morning before work, I'm like, I don't know how much longer I can continue like operating like this. Like something's got to change. And my normal coping strategies, which were not healthy, by the way, of, just doing more work, getting more accolades, being much defending myself verbally. Like I used to, for lack of a better term, be an asshole. Like I would, if I ever felt someone was challenging me or like anything, like even if they were just giving feedback, I would use my, the empathy that I naturally have. Instead of for good, I would use that to like really just dig a knife into someone to shut them down, because I was so terrified of people finding out I wasn't perfect, because I'd built this veneer of perfection up. So, and as you can imagine, like treating people like that and working harder, or, with all this other turmoil going on, is like a recipe for disaster. So I just remember thinking right before I got in the shower, I'm like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So I did the last refuge of a scoundrel. So I like to say, I said a prayer, and up to this point, I had actively shunned religion, based on experiences I had and things I observed, going to Catholic school. I wanted nothing to do with religion, but I'm like, I'm at the end of my rope here. Like, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
So I, asked for strength, courage, and wisdom. And like, at that moment, like I felt like a warm sensation come over me. And I'm like, I've either just lost my mind or maybe there's something to this God thing. And that day in 2009 was when my heart just changed, and I did a lot of self-reflection. Like, why was I treating people like this? Just self-awareness really developed, and I really worked on using the logical side of my brain, as a test engineer. So it is a very data-driven thing. Like I said, it's pass or fail. Like what worked, what didn't work.
Right.
And I started just collecting data on myself. Like, okay, I just lashed out at that person in the meeting. I don't want to be like that anymore. Why did I do that? And I started doing the self-work and, counseling and things like that to turn my life around a complete 180.
Mm-hmm. So you're doing therapy with a therapist and that kind of thing as well?
Yeah, I'd done therapy before all this happened, and I'd done a lot of unpacking, but it helped me understand kind of the reason why I was so anxious and depressed. But I really just kind of leaned into my faith and just started changing the way I showed up in the world, and the relationships that then entered my life, because I was allowing them to, and I wasn't pushing people away, really, really helped foster, the change of heart. And, that's kind of what has eventually led me down the path of, figuring out like what imposter syndrome is and things like that, and how it was affecting me, and now how I could turn that volume down of it, and now paying that forward to other people.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, that you're mentioning the, saying of a prayer and leaning into faith when that wasn't, when that wasn't something that you'd done previously. And on this show, this was never meant to be a God-centered kind of show. But what I've discovered through all of these interviews is that within everybody that's had these transformations, a higher power, God, faith, it's somewhere in there, which is pretty powerful. It's one of the powerful parts of that. So that change, is that still something that you lean into?
Oh, absolutely. I lean into, Christianity, and from the point of view of, I always joke with people when people like kind of are like, oh, you Christians are just, a bunch of hypocrites. I said, yeah, I don't know what version of the Bible other people listen to, but my Jesus isn't an asshole.
Yeah.
He treats everyone with love and compassion, regardless, or actually, especially people that aren't quote unquote perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the way I approach things, is just trying to, show love and compassion to everyone, regardless of what their beliefs are, because no one's perfect.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's absolutely true. I mean, you went from this persona of perfection that you'd said, that you were trying to put this veneer of perfection on, to now, accepting that nobody's perfect. And so did that change come with faith, or did it come through some kind of process, or how did you reconcile that?
Again, it all circles back to self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I just always believed that if I were anything less than perfect, everything would fall apart. People would leave me.
Yeah.
And once I started taking a step back, where's the truth in that? And it's like, no, you make mistakes all the time, and, your friends, your family haven't walked away from you. It's that self-awareness of looking at things, and then, going back to what the guy Skip who hired me, who I asked if he was springing for a plane ticket to Mars, he would always say, what's the data say? He called me Molly. Molly, what's the data say? One good test is worth 1,000 opinions. What's the data say? So,
everybody needs a boss like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, he's no longer with us, but he'll never leave me. That's for sure. He was a hoot, man.
That's great. So the data. So it's basically data-driven self-awareness. You're looking for the data on yourself, and the question you're asking to get that data is where is the truth? Where how am I participating in this, and that kind of thing. So that led you kind of down the path of recognizing. Well, I mean, you were kind of feeling this lack of fulfillment in that job, anxiety, depression, all of that kind of stuff. Now, what led you to the path of photography, and how did that transformation happen, or how did that switch happen?
Well, it certainly wasn't a switch. It goes back to, I think, when I was like 7 years old, and I wanted like a gerbil or a hamster for my birthday. And my mom, and her, infinite wisdom, was like, no, you are not responsible enough for that. So to this day, she doesn't know why, but she got me a camera, like an old school little like Kodak push the thumb thing, and it advanced the film camera.
Yeah.
And she got it for me when I was like 7. I just fell in love with it and just continued that as a hobby all my life. And when they would send me to these, work trips where I'd be gone for weeks at a time, I had an all expense paid trip to, Antarctica or the Mojave Desert, I'd throw my camera in my bag.
Mm-hmm.
And because I started doing landscape photography, and, had some success with that, and selling some artwork. And at the time I was, really doing all this self-development and, making this 180 swing in my life. And at the same time, the company that I was working for, they venture capitalists that owned them started changing the direction of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And like all these things started changing at once. And looking back on it, I'm like, okay, this all makes perfect sense. But
right.
like in the middle of it, it's like, what is happening? Like everything, like I'm a different person. The company I'm working for is, different. Like it's not jiving anymore. Now what?
Yeah.
And, so I started taking the photography more seriously, got a business license when people wanted to give me money to do it, which, gobsmacked me.
Mm-hmm.
And I left that company after almost 16 years of being with them and doing what what I felt any responsible father of 3 young kids would do. I went and took another engineering position where I made even more money and was even less fulfilled and miserable there.
Yeah.
Not because of the people, but it just wasn't, it just wasn't satisfying my soul. And it was a day, probably pretty close to like right around this time of year where I'm in coastal Delaware. And it gets pretty nasty here in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 35 degrees and rain.
Yeah.
And I remember, man, the rain was like coming down the back of my jacket. I was like all hunkered in walking into work one day, and I thought, thank God I'm getting paid so much money to be this miserable.
Yeah.
And it like, it was like a wake up call. Like when I said those words in my head, it's like, what are you doing, dude? Like,
mm-hmm.
What would I tell my friends, or more importantly, like my kids, if they came and said they were this like unhappy, throughout their day?
Yeah.
So, I told my wife, and she's like, you should do your photography full time. And like, I was gobsmacked when she said that, because my wife is like the planner, every like she has a plan for everything. And I'm much more like, she's the person that's like, okay, we're going to the airport. I got the tickets printed. I got the rental car reserved. Here's our itinerary for the vacation. I'm like, cool. Where are we going?
Yeah.
So to have my wife say like, well, you should just do your photography. I'm like, are you out of your mind? I had all these, what the author John Acuff calls noble obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
And, all these reasons why I couldn't do it. She's like, John, if it doesn't work out, just, go back to a workaday job.
Yeah.
And that was on April 7th. That'll be 6 years ago, and haven't gone back. And it's wild the way things work, because a couple years ago, a program I worked on for Homeland Security got reactivated, and they hired me then as a consultant to do engineering. So my full-time job, which used to be my side hustle of photography, is now my full-time job, and my side hustle for a while was engineering. So I was like, I told my kids, I'm like, that's the importance of like treating people with respect, even on the way out the door. Like, cause if I had, peeled out of the parking lot with my middle finger out of the sunroof, blasting Kid Rock, doing donuts in the parking lot, that probably would not have been the reality. But, I just said, it's just not working out, and, we went our separate ways. So it's wild how things work.
Yeah. Yeah. It goes to show you definitely don't blast Kid Rock in any situation, really. But yeah, especially going out.
That's a good call.
Yeah. Could you describe what noble obstacles are? Yeah, that's the first time I've heard that phrase.
Oh, really?
I'd love to kind of know more about how.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a phrase coined by, like I said, John Acuff.
Yeah.
He's actually one of Rory Vaden's buddy, which is how we came together through Rory's group.
Right.
And what John describes as noble obstacles are those things that on the surface seem like a great reason not to do something. Case in point, like I'm making six figures as an engineer, high level engineer. And I have a wife and 3 kids. So I need to make enough money to so we don't lose our house and lose, the kids aren't going to school in burlap bags and things like that.
Right.
When the reality is, you can make money being a photographer. You can make very good money being a photographer. Mm-hmm. But I was letting that noble obstacle, that thing that people really wouldn't challenge, because it was such a noble thing. Well, he's providing for his family, so he's sticking with this job. That's what a noble obstacle is. Just It's basically an excuse that sounds like you're a really good, solid person for taking that path, but really it's like, let's actually see if that's BS or not.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'm glad you described that, because it's so helpful to put a name to things like that.
Absolutely.
I mean, just to name it, it's just like, oh yeah, that's a thing, and that's what I'm doing. Maybe I should look at that more closely because I'm unfulfilled. Yeah, that's important. So first, so obviously you left the engineering world, you entered the photography world, and immediately everything worked out perfectly, right? Is that how it went?
Oh yeah. There were no afternoons I spent curled up, 5 feet from where I'm at now in my home office crying. Yeah, that never happened.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody.
Everybody. Yeah, entrepreneurship's no problem at all.
Right.
Yeah, that couldn't be further from the truth.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how did it go?
It's going well, and it's a continual exercise in agility. It's a great way to describe it. And again, that self-awareness is so key, because when I started doing photography full time, I did a lot of commercial stuff, commercial photo shoots, because I had a business background, and the Fortune 500 companies that would hire me loved it because, let's face it, artists a lot of times aren't known for their attention to detail.
Right.
And my previous career as a test engineer, like we lived by checklists, because you could live or die with some of the things. We could get into perilous situations if you didn't connect a red wire, before the blue wire, like kind of things. So
well, if I've learned anything from Die Hard, that's the truth.
Yeah, right. That and wear shoes.
Right.
Watch out for the glass. Anyway, before we fall down whether that's a holiday movie or not, I'll digress. I don't want to polarize your audience.
Everyone, poll. We'll do a poll in the
yeah, right. That'll generate some comments. But yeah, so I would do these commercial shoots, and I was used to doing checklists. So the commercial clients loved it, because like I would just knock out all the stuff, and they'd be like, "Wow, this is great. A photographer that actually can follow directions." Mm-hmm. And then as I would do that, I became more and more comfortable with myself, and I never wanted to photograph people. And what I came to realize, it was because I didn't have the confidence yet to look foolish in front of people. Again, circling back to this veneer of perfection. And once I got past that fear of like saying like, all right, do this pose. No, it didn't work. All right, we're going to do something else. It just like unlocked this whole other side of creativity and purpose that I didn't know was even an option for me, because I mentioned I have, extreme amounts of empathy, and I would use that, as for the forces of evil, as I, used to say.
Yeah.
But once I turned that empathy around and could really create these connections with people and help people feel safe, I started realizing how powerful portraits were to creative people, because like I said, like when I'll like look at my bio if I'm like not feeling up to something, I'll be like, okay, that's right, I got this. Well, something even more powerful than looking at like your own like biography is looking at a badass picture of yourself. Like, it doesn't have to be done by a professional person, but like everyone listening, like, you of course knows what it feels like when you see a picture that you don't like of yourself. It's easy to start the negative self-talk, but everyone's at least probably seen one picture of themselves. They're like, wow, that I look awesome there.
Yeah.
So that's how I approach my portrait photography, which is now what I solely do, is portrait photography. Because I want people to have these tangible evidence of how awesome they are. So like I do print products now.
Yeah.
So people can actually like look at themselves, and people are like, that's weird. I don't know about having a picture of myself. It's like, well, you don't have to have it hanging in your foyer. Put it like where you get changed. And if it's a picture that makes you feel like Wonder Woman, when you look at it, you're going to be thankful you had that on those days where you wake up and you're like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So that's how I approach the photography aspect, which fits greatly with like the imposter syndrome keynotes, is because I want people to feel, I don't want people to feel worth less. I want them to realize they're worth more than they even realize. And I want to give people the skills and proof of that, of how worthy they are of love and respect and all the good things life can give them.
Yeah. That's such a powerful method of, and a purpose for that medium of photography.
Yeah.
Because, when we talked before, you'd mentioned a crazy statistic that I think it's something like 90% of people just don't like getting their picture taken.
It's
right?
probably like closer to 99.
99.
Yeah. I always joke. It's like, other than a dentist, I can't think of another occupation other than a photographer where people are like, hey, I'm going to hire you and I'm going to give you not an insignificant amount of money, but I hate this.
Yeah.
So I've structured my business through, having some wonderful coaches enter my life where we remove the stress people have, those normal sticking points. So I help them pick their clothes out 2 weeks before the photo shoot, whether I go to their home and help them, because some things don't translate well onto camera. And there are some tricks of the trade that I want to help people with, because their first question is always like, well, what do I wear? I'm like, all right, well, cool. We're going to figure this out. And a lot of people are like, oh, great. I just have an excuse to go get some new clothes after, we go through their wardrobe.
Right.
But then even on the day of the shoot, I always offer professional hair and makeup on location. So they don't have to worry if the wind's blowing or if it's a, hot day outside and their makeup's running. And actually, men, like dudes like you and me, are the ones who actually love that pampering the most, because I don't know about you, but like my skin never really gets very much TLC.
Right. Definitely not.
So like, getting their eyebrows under control, or the gal Kelly, my hair and makeup artist I partner with, like she calls the clients and is like, all right, well, tell me about your skin. And there's one guy that got headshots. He's like, I don't know about all this. And then she said, well, tell me about your skin. Do you like your skin? He's like, I don't know, I'm a guy. And she said, do you have any dry patches? He's like, well, I've always had this red splotchy stuff and my skin's always dry here but oily here. She's like, okay, well, I'm going to develop a regimen for you. And like he fell in love with it. Like she sent him home with like cream. He's like, this is the greatest thing ever. So, and then during the shoot, because I always say the number one question I get being a photographer is, what do I wear? Yeah. The number two question is, what do I do with my hands during the shoot? Like, what do I do with them? So I've had training on that.
Yeah.
So I guide them, I guide them verbally, like what to do. And then after the shoot, I help them review what images they want and which ones work, for different reasons. Because, there's nothing worse than getting like a gallery of like 90 pictures and you're just staring at yourself. It's like, well, now what do I do? So I guide them through that. And then, we put together albums for them if they want like a album. Yeah. Because it's not just like we send them the digitals and say, all right, well, good luck creating your album and learning new software. Like my wife does all the graphic design and lays them out in these heirloom quality albums. Or if they get wall art printed, like big frame prints, I get that all printed, framed for them. And I even go to their home and hang it. So
that's incredible.
It's like all the like touch points where people have these like pain or like things get stuck. Like worked really hard to remove those or mitigate them as much as possible.
Yeah, that's incredible, because I mean, you're turning this thing that just seems like an inconvenience or something that has to be done, something that people don't like, into a personal development session.
Yeah.
I mean, you're turning it into something that can transform people and the way people look at themselves. That's so powerful. And it's, so it's, something that's being used typically for external purposes. Like, well, I need to get a picture taken because, I need it for whatever it might be, for my business purposes or whatever it may be, to internal purposes. Like, I'm going to hang this in my closet. I'm going to look at it every day, and I'm going to feel that person that I become. That's huge. What kind of, and what kind of response are you getting to that?
People love it. The first thing I always do is make sure to have a complimentary consult call with people, which they can schedule right on my website, molluraphoto.com, and just talk to them about what they're looking for. And truthfully, what I do mostly is I listen to them. I'll give them some prompts, and the rule my coach Megan always said was, listen, you talk 30%, you let them talk the 70%. Just listen and let them tell you. And people just share so much. And then during the photo shoot, there's such a connection there and such a trust, and, helping them feel safe to explore that experience. It's almost like a mini therapy session. People just just share so much, and it's really cool to walk with people through that.
That's great. And what have you, and so that kind of transitioning to the imposter syndrome and what you've learned about that, and what you've learned from yourself and from these experiences and sharing time with people when they're most vulnerable. Mm-hmm. You're developing a keynote on imposter syndrome, or you've developed one, and you're doing that. What kind of advice would you give to people who are experiencing that imposter syndrome?
Yeah, if there's one thing I want people to leave with, that I want them to remember, is that fear hates facts. Like imposter syndrome or any kind of negative emotion is, especially if it's fear-based, fear will shrivel up and die when you shine like some facts on it. So just remember, fear hates facts. Like, okay, I'm not feeling up for this. Why? Like, what's going on? What's the data? What's the truth that supports this fear? Mm-hmm. And I bet 9 times out of 10, or probably closer to 10 times out of 10, there won't be any facts supporting the fear. But what I can guarantee people have is a boatload of facts supporting that they actually are capable or are worthy. So I want people to remember that fear hates facts, and get what the facts and truth are.
Do you have a method or some kind of technique to get to the facts? Like what kind of questions should people be asking on that front?
Yeah, one of the things I always suggest that people do is that to write down things that they've accomplished or they're proud of. And the crazy thing about fear, fear is, likes to give sucker punches. And one of the ways it does that is it doesn't play by the same rules of the space-time continuum.
Sure.
It'll cause fear based on something that happened decades ago. So because fear doesn't fight fair, I encourage people to also not fight fair and do their own guerrilla warfare against fear. So write down things that you're proud of, that you've accomplished, whether it's something that you did this morning, you made a great omelet, or if it's you won the Pinewood Derby when you were a 8-year-old Cub Scout. Like, write that stuff down, and once you get rolling on it, like, it's actually fun. And that's something you can look back on to say, oh, this is something I've done. Like, here's a great, for instance, to show that I practice what I preach. John Acuff, the author I mentioned with the Noble Obstacles, challenged a group that I'm in, that he runs, to write 30 things. He calls it your awesome list. Like, write down 30 things that you're proud of.
Yeah.
And here's my, here's my 30 things, and then here's the 60 things, then here's the 90 things, and like it just kept going. Like, it got to be like a lot of fun, and I put that together about a month ago.
That's so cool.
And even if I don't like physically look at it, I know it's there in my notebook, and it will jog things in my memory. So I always encourage people just to write it down, note it in your phone, a hard copy, old school like me. But yeah, just write down just things that you've accomplished.
Yeah. And it sounds like that's a great way to get into flow, because those 30 things that you started writing down, I would imagine it was probably difficult for like the first 5, but then it might have just started kind of going. Yeah. So when
I felt like a total tool doing the first couple. I'm like, come on. I hate saying good things about myself. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
Again, then that comes back to the self-awareness. Like, dude, just
do the thing.
Celebrate yourself.
Yeah.
Do the thing, dude.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, and so any other kind of wise words on imposter syndrome or developing that, developing the person we want to be, or what would you say to somebody who's experiencing that, right now in their job, or having that experience of like, I'm not fulfilled and I want to leave, but I feel like I can't?
Yeah. The first thing I want to do is celebrate them for recognizing that, because one of the things that I talked about that was so instrumental in turning my life and my way of being around was being self-aware. So if you're even admitting it for the first time right now, after, you just heard Adam say that, I'm not really fulfilled, I want to celebrate that and then dig into that. And, what are some things maybe that make me unfulfilled? Spin it the positive way. What are things that light me up? What do I like to do? What are things, accomplishments I've made? And recognize that it takes a lot of grace to do this work with yourself. And I can pretty much guarantee that if people are listening to a podcast like this, they probably treat people pretty well. And I always encourage people to say, be as gentle with yourself and kind with yourself as you are with other people.
Yeah.
And recognize that this is a process. It's not like they're going to write down, 30 things that they did great, and they're going to be like, oh, well, imposter syndrome's gone. Like, that's not what this is. It's all about turning down the volume of that negative voice and reducing the number of occurrences.
Yeah.
And then being able to kind of anticipate when it comes back up. That's
great advice. Yeah. And something that comes up pretty frequently is give yourself grace, be gentle on yourself. And yeah, this was great. There's so many great nuggets in here that I think people can get from imposter syndrome. And I know you're doing more keynotes on that subject, more keynote, and, on positive change and how we could change ourselves. Where can people find you and get in touch and find out more?
Yeah. So I mentioned my photography website, which is molluraphoto.com. And whether you remember that or you remember the website for my public speaking, which is just johnmollura.com, they link to each other. So if you wind up in one place and you wind up on the photo site and you say, oh, I wanted to see the keynote, click the tab at the top and it'll jump you right over to there. And, I do in-person speaking, workshops or virtual stuff, through the miracle of technology that we have now.
Yeah.
So I'm always just happy to, like I said, do complimentary consult calls, whether it's speaking or photography, which they can schedule right on either website.
That's awesome. Well, you've got so much knowledge to share and so much wisdom and experience, and I'm grateful that you shared it here. And thank you for sharing this. And please get in touch with John. Reach out. And I'm excited to see where you go, man, because this is exciting stuff, and I know that a lot of people are going to be helped by your message. So
yeah.
Thank you for joining us today, John.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for helping me spread the word, brother.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining in and tuning in today, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Hey, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Flow Over Fear podcast. If you'd like to learn more about getting into flow and learn the foundations of flow, I have a free video series on my website at www.adamcliffordhill.com called The Foundations of Flow. Feel free to go there and download it and start your journey to rising above fear and achieving greater flow in your life. And if you liked this episode, and I'm guessing you did if you stuck around for this long, then please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button, and you will receive notifications when I have new interviews, new recaps, and new trainings that pop up on YouTube. Thanks again for joining us.